Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for participating in FOIA Fest 2021. And thank you for registering for this particular session that's going to be focusing on the gang database and how to research and write about the gang database. What makes this session in particular different than others is that the majority of panelists are not journalists themselves, right? They are community members, organizers, researchers, and I'll be the only journalist on this panel today. So let's go around and introduce ourselves. Let's say our names, what's our title or occupation, and how did each one of us become introduced to the gang database for the first time. Anybody can start.
I can go first. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ray Wences. My pronouns are they, them. I'm based in Chicago. I'm a Chicago organizer, but currently my title is as communications director of another organization called Unemployed Workers United. But I'm here because between 2018 and 2020, I was one of the lead coordinators for the Erase the Gang database campaign. And I became involved because through the work that Organized Communities Against Deportation does, we realized that there were actually other ways in which the Chicago Police Department was criminalizing people, and how ICE, the Immigration Enforcement Agency, had access to that information. And so it seemed to us like a good opportunity once we found out about the gang database and its origins to engage in a full both grassroots campaign and policy campaign to try to change that.
Hey everyone, my name is Alex Goodwin. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a member of BYP 100, and I'm also a researcher and organizer at Action Center on Race and the Economy. When the reason or why I got involved in this particular campaign to abolish the gang database, I heard Chicago chapter member Janae Bonsu talking about it in one of our meetings, and she was really leading the work for our chapter. And I just remember feeling, I think like most people, a sense of outrage around just like this massive police reach and influence over our communities. And I was like, really moved and in a way towards frustration and anger around just like what the long-term implications meant for a database like this to exist.
Hey everyone, my name is Andy Clarno. I'm on the faculty at UIC in Sociology and Black Studies. I'm also the coordinator of the Policing in Chicago Research Group. This is a research team at UIC that provides research support to social movements. And as the campaign to erase the gang database was just beginning, we were starting to have conversations with BYP 100, OCAD, and other organizations in the city about ways that a research team at UIC may be able to provide research support to provide resources and support to campaigns against racist policing and profiling in the city. So that's how we got connected to the campaign, and we've been working with them from the start.
Thanks, everyone. Just to also introduce myself, my name is Jackie Serrato, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Southside Weekly newspaper. The earliest stages of my journalism also revolved around understanding the incidents of violence in my community of Little Village, and why it seemed like the city was not addressing the issue with any seriousness, right, other than deploying more police. And so I started to question around like 2015 what it meant to be gang affiliated and how the city defined gangs in Chicago. And that's how I kind of became involved with this issue too. So moving forward with this conversation, I would like us to talk about the facts of what we know so far about the gang database. One thing I can say is that it's not just one gang database in the singular, but it's really an ecosystem of data that the Chicago Police Department manages and has access to and shares with a ton of other agencies. So if we can just go around and share what are some of the facts that we have found in our research and organizing. And we can get started with Andy.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just start, and, feel free to jump in, fill in gaps or whatever. I'll try not to take too much time here, but just kind of as a quick overview, the Chicago Police Department maintains 15 to 18 different ways of tracking gang affiliation. But they've got two main databases, right? One is the gang arrest card database, which is a gang arrest card is what gets produced whenever police stop someone and arrest them, and in the process identify that person as a gang member. Then they write up a gang arrest card. The other one is called the investigatory stop report database. So investigatory stop reports are what happens when police pull somebody over and search them, stop and frisk, right? But it doesn't end in an arrest. If it doesn't end in an arrest, what gets produced is an investigatory stop report. And so that's another way where through those stops, they identify people as gang members. Now, the gang arrest card database has over 135,000 people on it. The investigatory stop report database has 140,000 people identified as gang members or more. There's some overlap there, but it's impossible to know exactly how much. So that's on the part of the Chicago police. Cook County Sheriff used to maintain their own gang database. The state has their own. ICE maintains gang databases. Other states have gang databases. And the FBI maintains an overall system of gang tracking as well. So a lot of their FBI information is sourced from local police departments. So that information from CPD will flow up to the FBI, which maintains the National Gang Information Center and their own databases there.
I can add to that in terms of how it's impacted the immigrant community, and the facts that we know is that, as mentioned, federal agencies have access to these databases. And so what we have seen is the ways in which, with the increase of criminalization and deportations, ICE has actually used this information to go after people and be able to go to people's homes based on the information that is taken during these arrests that Andy mentioned. We also know that it has being on the gang database not only can lead to deportation proceedings, because let's say ICE got the information from CPD and then they got to your home, but it actually can also impact any process immigration legal process that you have. So for example, we have heard of DACA recipients or people that would benefit from DACA being either denied or their renewal gets denied because they are in the gang database. We have also seen in terms of how it impacts people in terms of mobility. I mean, we have a lot of anecdotes from people just telling us that one of the facts that or consequences that happens after their information is in these gang databases is consistent stops and arrests or interactions with the police, right? Which calls to attention, there is a sense of harassment that leads that people experience after their information is in this gang database. And also another thing is that people cannot remove themselves, or at least when we started the campaign, one of the main things that we were outraged about was the fact that people were not being notified that their information was being added to these lists. There was no process to remove information from the list. And then again, the long-term consequences that would have on people seem like something to address.
Would you like to add anything, Alex? Okay. Yeah, so based on what we know, there's about 128,000 or 130,000 individuals who are within this gang database ecosystem. And as Ray mentioned, there were two separate lawsuits I believe in 2017 by undocumented men in the Southwest side who were detained, and they were placed in deportation proceedings because they were added to the gang list erroneously. And so a lot of the organizing around the gang database did begin in the undocumented community. Ray, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, actually, So there were a couple of raids that were being led by immigration enforcement at different corners of the city around 2017, 2018. I think I would also like to make a point that that's under the Trump administration, right? So we started definitely seeing a lot more of these practices and use of technology to go after people. And what was happening is that ICE was actually showing up at corners where jornaleros or day laborers were stationed. And not only were they there to criminalize them and remove them from those corners where the people usually look for work, but they were actually also adding their information to the gang database, right? And so part of the work that OCAD was doing at the time was pushing the city council, the Chicago City Council, to remove the carve-outs or the loopholes that the current, or at the time, the Welcoming City Ordinance had. So Chicago, since Rahm Emanuel, like the city liked to say that we are a sanctuary city and that there was no police ICE collaboration. However, with these 4 loopholes, one of the loopholes that was around was actually that CPD or ICE could interfere, or there could be police ICE collaboration if an individual was in the gang database. And so we found out about this also not only through our advocacy with to remove the carve-outs with the Chicago Immigration Working Group, which is a collective of organizations that was pushing the advocacy and policy in City Council, but we also ended up finding out exactly what happens when CPD and ICE collaborate with the case of Wilmer Catalan Ramirez. So Wilmer was an individual from the Brighton Park neighborhood that was violently detained in front of his family. His wife was able to record the whole raid. And as we started asking as organizers, we got in touch with the family and we started asking questions, right? Like, why did he get detained? Like, why is ICE going after him? Does he have other arrests? I mean, the type of questions that we would ask with any deportation case that we support. And then that's when we found out that there was, like, the city came back to us, or ICE came back to us telling us, well, this person is in the gang database. And then that's when we realized that, like, okay, like, we can continue to push for making Chicago a sanctuary city through the removal of the carve-outs, but there's a bigger problem here that actually can get addressed in other ways. And that's when we started, I think, opening up. It kind of shifted, kind of like what Alex was saying, you know, BYP 100, we were also having conversations with them, because one of the things that we started to find out through the research is that it's Black individuals in the city that are the most impacted. And so it felt like a great opportunity to do cross-movement collaboration with our partners in the city that were on the same page in terms of abolishing this tool that CPD uses to target and demonize our community members.
I'm wondering if we know what is the demographic breakdown of the databases. Does anybody know?
I was gonna say, go ahead, Andy, but I think the majority, I'm just like looking back through our report, out of the 128,000 that we know about, over 90,000 are Black and 31,000 are Latinx. Andy, do you have other numbers?
Yeah, on both of those databases that I was talking about before, 70% are Black, 25% are Latinx. So we're talking about 95% of people on both of these lists are Black or brown. Yeah, so, you know, obviously this is the result of the over-policing in Black and brown neighborhoods in this city, right? The way that the Black communities in particular are surveilled by the Chicago Police Department and targeted with aggressive stops and searches. You know, then people end up getting placed in this database. And like Ray said, it has real impacts on people for their entire life. You don't get off of the database, and it shapes everything, right? It shapes your interactions with police when they pull you over and your name pops up on the gang database. The interaction changes, right? The cops come to your door with their hands on their guns, right? And they, you know, the potential for violence really escalates. It has impacts in court on people's sentencing decisions, their chances for getting bail and bond. You know, as Ray was talking about, for immigrants, it has real consequences in terms of the ability to stay in this country. But, you know, I think what's also important about this is the police department has some criteria that they're supposed to use to determine whether or not somebody is a gang member, right? So they have criteria like if you self-admitted, if you're wearing particular colors, or if you, flash symbols. They've got a whole list of criteria that they're supposed to use. But what we've been able to learn, through this campaign is that the police department doesn't require them to provide any evidence to back this up. So on the gang arrest card database, 88% of the people on that database supposedly self-admitted, but the police don't have to prove that they self-admitted. All they have to do is click a box when they're submitting their report to say, this person admitted to me that they're a gang member, right? When we've done interviews with people who are involved in street organizations, what we hear consistently is, I never told the cops that, right? I never self-admitted to the police. But the police don't have to back it up. So they have 88% of the people on their list supposedly have self-identified. Another 11% of the people on the list, the police didn't provide any reason why they added them to the list. So that's 99% of the people on this gang arrest card database are there just at the discretion of the officer, right? So what it means in practice is, if police stop a young person of color in a neighborhood that the police consider to be gang territory, right? This is what happened to Whitmer, or with people that they consider to be gang members, then they add that person to the list too. You don't even have to be arrested, right? You just have to be stopped and searched. You end up on a gang database and bound. The impacts are there. So you could really feel the way that over-policing of Black and brown communities gets translated onto these databases, which we can look at the way in which that information is just shaped by practices of racist policing. But then it gets into these databases and it's treated like a fact, and ICE picks it up and they're just like, no, look, it's a fact. He's a gang member, right? It's written in the database. And so they treat it as like some objective measure of truth, when it's really, just a product of the kind of racist policing that we've seen in Chicago for such a very long time.
Alex, what has been the reaction in Black communities as we have been learning more and more about the gang databases?
Yeah, to be honest, it's pretty mixed. I think like on a larger scale, when we're talking about abolishing the gang database, we're also talking about the abolition of police. And I think that that is, we're getting like mixed responses, because we don't want to discount the everyday violence, like the very real things that people experience in their neighborhoods. And at the same time, like we also want to push for more like life affirming solutions. A gang database is not that. And so, yeah, I would say, as usual, people are always very outraged when they find more on the like incompetencies of CPD. And at the same time, like we have to be prepared to talk about alternative solutions. So I think the gang database is also like a really strong entry point for like how we start talking about defunding and abolishing CPD.
I'm curious as to what FOIA requests each of you panelists or your respective organizations has filed, and what has been the response to your FOIA requests?
I can go in terms of talking about how we started using FOIAs, or thinking about FOIAs for like during the campaign. But yeah, I mean, really, like there's been I think a series of different efforts to try to get information from the city. And one of those efforts actually was in one of the organizing strategies that we had, or tactics that we had actually, was to try to get people to submit FOIA. So like first we started with organizers within like our organizations to try to see if our information would be there. I remember even like signing to like send my FOIA in, got back that information. Then we were like, okay, it was almost like a trial and error thing, especially because when we're talking about undocumented immigrants or people with like past interactions with the police, submitting a FOIA sometimes may lead to other unwanted interactions from like law enforcement agencies. And so we were really trying to be careful in terms of like what information is the FOIA requiring, what information are we putting out there. And then it was maybe sometime a year and a half ago when one of the organizations that is part of the campaign to raise the gang database, Beyond Legal Aid, one of their attorneys created with other volunteers, they created a website that was basically walking people down through like a process, like a step-by-step of like, what is a FOIA? Here's how FOIA have been used. this is how a FOIA could be used to obtain your information if you're in the gang database. Here are some resources. And so it was an automatic tool that the idea was that people could just like log in on the website and and put their email in, and then they would start to receive automatic responses from the city to that email about their FOIAs. So I think there's been, like, again, different types of efforts, but I think all of them with the goal to try to obtain information, right? And so we were using the FOIAs because that was like the tool that we had at our disposal. However, there are other ways in which we can also get information from the city, and that was part of also the organizing strategy. That was that we weren't just going to wait for a CPD to give us the information through a FOIA, because in case people don't know, CPD actually doesn't like to respond to FOIAs, and especially FOIAs that have to do with information that could like make them look bad. So there was the potential of actually going into litigation because of the FOIAs. And so one of the other things that we actually did was pressure other government entities within the city of Chicago to try to hold accountable the city and get some transparency. So that's when we started also pressuring the Office of the Inspector General to try to get some of that information. And eventually, actually, the OIG ended up releasing a report that validated a lot of the things that we had been saying. It's just like now it had like the stamp of a government agency to back it up.
Yeah, before we get into the OIG, which is super important, I want to hear from the other two panelists about their FOIA requests.
Yeah, members of BYP 100, we participated in the FOIA clinics that Ray was just talking about. I think the thing that I felt was really important, and I think, I guess I liked about the process, was that in this FOIA tool that was created, responses are able to come back to the coalition. I think that adds like another sort of layer of safety and support for folks who are submitting their FOIAs. And I think, most of the members that I know of within my org that submitted their FOIAs came back as like not a part of the gang database, but I do think it raises questions about how CPD is tracking organizers, because we know that they have been. And so I think that is like another sort of layer here to be considered.
Yeah. So one of the things that's been, as Ray was saying, the CPD doesn't like to respond to FOIAs. So initially, the Policing in Chicago Research Group was submitting FOIAs asking for information about the gang database. We were getting a lot of obfuscation in response. You keep saying the gang database, but there's not a gang database, so we don't know what you're asking for, so we're not going to give you anything, right? And one of the things that became really useful about the Inspector General's report is that they kind of broke that down a little bit. And they were like, look, there's 15 to 18 different tools that the CPD uses to track gang membership. So now we're like, oh, okay, that's what they're saying when they're saying that there's not a gang database. They're saying there's 15 to 18 different ones, right? But it allowed us, to learn over time about how to more effectively write FOIAs, because when we have the specific names of the database that the police department uses and the different tools that they use, then our FOIAs became more effective, as we could ask about a particular piece of information, and then they've been more responsive because they don't have this simple idea to hide behind it. We don't know what you're asking for, so we're not going to give you anything. So that's one of the things that we've learned through this process, is that the more information you have, then the more information you can get, because you know what to ask for. And so there have been times when we've been able to, through a FOIA, get back pieces of information about things that we didn't know about before, and then we ask for those pieces. Then we learn about another tool that's out there, and we're able to write a FOIA asking about that. So I found that to be really effective, is kind of building on the knowledge that you have to ask for more and more specific things. That's been really effective in this campaign. Just kind of going back to the FOIA tool that Ray and Alex were talking about, that still exists, right? So on the Erase the Database campaign's website, which is erasethedataBase.com, there's a tab at the top called FOIA, and it'll take you to, the page where it walks people through step by step how to fill out a FOIA requesting their own form, their own information. And it'll even, kind of generate the email for you, if that's something that folks are interested in.
I believe I'm sharing my screen.
Yeah, see it.
And here you can see the tool that we're talking about, erasethedatabase.com/FOIA. And I think it's amazing that these organizations are empowering, regular individual residents to submit a FOIA asking, whether they themselves can be found within these gang databases. And it's, I think, a very straightforward tool, so that if you're not a journalist, if you're not a researcher, if you don't have like the background that you need to submit a successful FOIA, I feel like this really breaks it down and makes it easy for people to access and use. Ray, is there anything you want to add about the type of information that this tool asks of people, and then what happens to that information?
Yeah, well, what I wanted to add was that this, to be able to land this type of tool, we actually had a kind of long vetting process in terms of like the questions that were being included, and that type of information that was getting collected or either sent to the CPD, because they're one of our interests as organized communities against deportations was to ensure that undocumented people could feel like they could use this tool and send a FOIA without fear of retaliation, whether from the CPD or ICE. And then the other thing that I would say is that, yeah, like what Alex mentioned, it is like part of this is not only meant to be a tool for people to access it and get your FOIA, but it's actually also meant to be a tool to connect to the coalition and to connect to the organizing that's still happening.
Okay, so let's move on to the Office of the Inspector General. How did he even get involved?
I don't remember. I don't quite remember. But from my perspective, when I was in OCAD, I just know that we were reached out by the community liaison at the time at the office that was really interested in basically having community hearings. And like they basically told us, like, as the OIG, they explained to us who they were. To me, I was just kind of like, who is the OIG? But once I knew who they were and kind of like the type of resources that they could put into this campaign, I was like, well, yeah, that's their job. Like they should be investigating. And this is part of the thing that we want to investigate. So as organizers, we didn't necessarily partner up with the OIG, but we were kind of amplifying whenever they were having community sessions. They had a couple of community sessions here in Little Village. And I remember that OCAD organizers were there present. And so from there, it kind of just organically became a kind of like back and forth, right? Like they continued with their investigation. They went to different neighborhoods in the city, but we were actually reaching out to them whenever we felt like the report was taking some time. We were like, hey, when is the OIG report coming out? When is the OIG report coming out? So I think again, it's like leveraging, those access to information, and also we were also leveraging the influence that these people had. So we knew that like if the OIG was more likely to be able to schedule a meeting with the CPD than we were, right? Or try to get that information. And so in a way, we were also organizing the OIG to try to help us with our goals.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of things to that. Out of all the organizing that took place after the murder of Laquan McDonald, one of the things that was created was an office within the Inspector General's office that was focused on public safety, focused on monitoring and inspecting the police department. And so this was the organization that did, the part of the Inspector General's office that did this work was that public safety office, which was created out of these protests, after Laquan was killed. So I think that's also really important, is realizing that, that people put the pressure on the city to create this office to begin with. And in November 2017, BYP 100 and OCAD teamed up with Critical Resistance to hold a teach-in on the gang database, and presented kind of the early findings that we had been able to find by that time about the gang database and a list of demands. And one of the demands that the coalition had put together was for the OIG to do an investigation into the gang database. And, you know, I don't know how this happened, but folks from the OIG's office were actually there at the teach-in. Right. And so they started to hear the information and they started to see that that was one of the first demands on the table from the very beginning. And they heard it, you know, and they picked it up and they followed through. So I think it's incredibly important. Also, just, you know, as a coalition that folks took that initiative to see that this would be a way to expose what was going on with the police department. And you know, it is a really important piece that other organizations could really pick up on, I think.
Wow, that's some great organizing. I wanted to ask, what were some of the new findings or the recommendations from the OIG?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that. Yeah, feel free to jump in. They confirmed, I think, what a lot of the research in the campaign had already been able to show, which was, you know, the demographics of it, the way that it was a tool for, you know, criminalizing Black and brown communities. They added some new information that we didn't know. They showed just how full of holes and problems it is. I mean, there were all kinds of just errors and mistakes throughout this database. People who are 130 years old, you know, people who are just being born, and, you know, they're listed as a year old. People who are being listed as members of multiple gangs. And I'm not talking about a few people, right? There were 25,000 people, 15% of the people on the list were listed as being members of multiple gangs. Some people as many as 9 different gangs. So this is it's a problem. It's a useless tool, right? They also were able to expose access to the database. So they showed that 500 different law enforcement agencies around the country have access to the Chicago Police Department's databases. And there's no controls over how they access or use that information. So they were able to show that ICE had searched the CPD's gang database 32,000 times from 2008 to 2018. 32,000 times they searched the database to try to identify people to target. So, you know, there was a lot of really powerful information that came out. They had huge recommendations on what needs to be done to address this. And, you know, the CPD is largely stalled and refused to take seriously the recommendations coming from the OIG.
Go ahead, Ray. I was just gonna say, I think, like, to build off what Andy was just sharing, and kind of just like reviewing what how the OIG summarized this. I think the fact that they uplifted that there was no procedural fairness around how the gang database is used, and then they have like a list of like 30 recommendations of how to fix it is actually not, I think, it's not what we're going for. It's not what the campaign is looking for, right? We're not looking for how do we like fix the gang database, or how is it used better, or how is it used more fairly. Like, we want to get rid of it. And I want to uplift that, because I think while the OIG holds a really, like, you know, can be a very critical piece to how and what we organize around. I think it can be a useful tool to us. It is also still like a tool of the city and the state. And I think that it's still important for us to push back even when these sort of findings come to light.
Yeah. And I think another way in which, like, maybe organically and part of like the synergy of the movements here in Chicago that is leading to is actually, so we know that the other agencies that can access the gang databases include not only ICE, but Chicago public schools also had like a very problematic connection there. The city never really was able to tell us who or how students' names, young people's names were being put in the database. They just told us that someone, just one person right out there, which we don't believe, right? And then the other thing too is that the sheriff's department also has access to the gang database. I believe there were like top 3 of local agencies that had access to the Chicago gang database. So even when we continued the campaign and then pivoted to targeting the Cook County gang database, we kind of knew that even if we got rid of the Cook County gang database, like these access to different agencies having access to different databases is actually, we need to get rid of the whole database. We can't just be cutting pieces and bits. But that also kind of led to some of the other strategies that we had, like the lawsuit, right? Like we know that the OIG is still part of the city, and we can fully trust them, right? And ultimately, the reason why the campaign was created is to abolish the gang database. So we not only are doing the research, but also are pushing the policy. We're pushing city council, and then we also submitted a lawsuit against the city for the use of the gang database and just like the violation of people's constitutional rights.
Yeah, that's concerning to me that, just how much CPS looks into and has access to this gang data. And obviously not just them, but the sheriff's office, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the list goes on. I wanted to ask about what was portrayed as a small victory a while back when the Cook County gang database was apparently shut down or something like that. Can you all expand on that?
I can start. But basically, what was it? 2 years ago, actually, the coalition to erase the gang database, like I mentioned, kind of expanded from just dealing with the gang databases at the municipal level to try to also move to pressuring the county officials to do something about it. And so what happened was that Commissioner Alma Anaya, had gotten information about the gang database, and she must have also been part of that, like the 2017 town hall or something, because right shortly after, she submitted, with the help of Chuy Garcia, they basically submitted an ordinance to try to have some audit on the gang database at the county level. And so what ended up happening is that kind of like opened up the space to then for the organizers to come in, and then try to hold Cook County accountable. And we started partnering up with other county officials. So we had a series of like meetings with county officials to try to like give them the information, because one of the things that was happening is that people just thought that they didn't really understand the gang database. So we had to do a lot of like background information. So a lot of the meetings that we had with county officials were about letting them know what the gang database was. And eventually we were able to push the public safety committee of the county to call for the ordinance that Anaya and Commissioner Brandon Johnson had drafted with some of our support, which was to basically decommission the gang database. That ordinance passed, but what happened was that we were successful in making sure that the sheriff decommissioned the gang database, so like no more use of the gang database, right? But what didn't happen, or what the county actually fell short, and we received a lot more resistance from, was an actual audit. So I remember when we were pushing for the audit, they were basically telling us, well, we decommissioned it already. There's, we don't have to do anything about it. There's an independent audit going on, and we can have public hearings until that audit is over. And we were kind of arguing that, well, there's enough content actually to go and have a public hearing, and there's enough questions to have the public hearing. And while you're doing your independent audit, we could have this discussion in front of the public, right? And so the resistance that we met from some of the county officials, it was disturbing to me, because I felt like they already knew that if they shut down the sheriff's department gang database, like the sheriff could still have a gang database through the CPD or other lists that are happening. So to me, it just felt like, oh yeah, we'll decommission the Cook County gang database. And then when we actually were like, well, we want more information, they didn't want to do that, and actually went ahead and destroyed all the data. Our intent was not for that data that was in the gang database to be destroyed. We actually wanted to like use it and analyze it and have access to it, so that maybe we could push for I don't know, reparations or some type of other response from the county for the harm that they have caused to people whose information was in the gang database, right? So anyway, all that to say that ultimately, I think that what I learned from that process is that we can't just keep passing ordinances and call that a day. Part of the issue with the gang database is actually around transparency, data acquisition, and violation of people's privacy, rights to privacy. And so I think like attacking the issue from that angle has opened up some other spaces to also think about other ways that technology is being used in Chicago. I mean, the gang database is one aspect of the increase of technology and how it's being used to target Black and brown people. But part of it too is that we see how city council, one of the challenges for organizers sometimes is actually getting city council to understand the scope of the problem, or is to get our elected officials to understand the scope of the problem. We can come with them with numbers, but ultimately, if we also don't hear from CPD directly, we're only going to have half of the story. And I think that that's what's been so frustrating about this campaign, was that for me, at least, up until I was involved in it, was that every victory, every small victory that we had was met with a lot more resistance from the city to give us more information. And I think that really speaks to just the culture of CPD, and just the challenges that every organization and movement has had to face with the Chicago Police Department. Not only can we not trust them, but we also have to fight them on even getting the information that they have.
So what happens with that data of, from the decommissioned database? Is it like in the cloud somewhere in limbo, or is it like actually destroyed?
Yeah, I mean, these are the questions that we were trying to ask at the time. So they had, it was an online database that other agencies could access through a secure website, and they took down the website, right? And then what they said is that they stored the database on 2 hard drives and put them in a vault, and eventually, I believe, followed through with the promise to destroy those things, like to smash them with the hammer, which is kind of interesting way to think about what does it take to erase a database. You smash it with the hammer. But what they didn't answer is, like, who had access to be able to download that database before it was destroyed, right? How many different agencies were able to take screenshots and save the information and download the information in various ways? And so it really raises very tough questions about what does it mean to for abolitionist campaigns when we're dealing with big data, right, which is stored and shared and moved around. And if one place erases it, has it just been shifted around to another place? These were questions that we were pushing the sheriff's department to answer, and that they refused. There were public hearings held. Cook County Commission held public hearings, and the sheriff's department didn't show up to answer any of the questions that were put before them.
I do want to add that the gangbanger label, somebody who is considered a gang member or gang affiliated, that label will follow them for the rest of their lives, right? As things are right now. Once a resident is identified as a documented gang member, it's not going to come off the record, not even through an expungement. So I think those are some of the demands, right, of the Erase the Database campaign, for there to be due process for not just adding a person to the system, but also how to remove their names, once they've either served their time or once, we realize that they were added erroneously, or once they've moved on and, are now living productive and law-abiding lives. So I wanted to ask, what are the next steps for the campaign? Have your demands changed in any way? What's in the works?
Well, we still want a public hearing, and we still want to abolish the gang database. Those are, I think, our top 2 focuses right now. And we know that any sort of ordinance or reversal will require, we're going to demand reparations. I think that's an absolute necessity in anything that comes out of this. And I think another challenge that we think we're up against, but it's very unclear because the city is unclear, is the CEIS, or this essentially the new gang database. So they've pledged to sort of stop using or get rid of the old one. However, there was an opportunity for folks to submit public comment, and there was sort of this whole thing that happened, I think in 2019 or maybe at the end of 2020. But in 2019, the city put out and CPD put out that they would be instituting this new form of a gang database, assuming that they are like implementing the OIG's recommendations to fix it. When really, I think it's the same form of surveillance, just like a different name. And so the city has been unclear, or CPD has been unclear about when that'll actually be implemented. So I think that is another space for us to question, and will definitely be another place that we have to push back against.
One of the things that they've said, that they'll do with this new database is they're still going to lean very heavily on this idea of people self-admitting to being members, right? But they're going to insist that they be recorded on a body cam, right? So then now this kind of reform becomes, more justification for increasing the number of cameras and surveillance in the city. But I think that one of the things that we'll need journalists and other folks to keep pushing on is like, what does self-admission look like? Like what are the conditions on which they're going to consider it a legitimate self-admission? Are people told that they have rights to remain silent before they're being asked to be, whether or not they're members? If somebody's pushed down on the hood of a car next to, other folks from their neighborhood, is that considered a legitimate form of questioning where, you may have kind of like peer pressure to say yes or no, I'm a member of an organization? Well, that could be considered a legitimate like self-admission. We've heard, reports from Los Angeles where actually what cops will do is push somebody on the hood of the car and say, look into the dash cam video, and they're not asking them to say, I'm a member of the organization from, the gang from this neighborhood. They're asking them, they say, look into the camera and, say F this group and F that group, like the people who are in your neighborhood, right? They want you to shout them down. And if you refuse to do so, then that counts as a self-admission. So what does self-admission look like? I think that this is going to be really need to be very heavily interrogated because the new database will be taken as fact and as accurate, and anybody who's on it will have a much, much harder time, fighting cases or ever getting off of it. So I think that we really need to be attentive to, what does it mean when somebody quote unquote self-admits, because that's going to really have a big impact on people for the rest of their lives, as you said.
Yeah, I think we need to be ready to scrutinize this new database, not just organizers and community people, but journalists too. What would you tell those journalists who are watching us right now? Would you encourage them to keep filing FOIAs? What kind of information is needed at this moment?
I would say just from like the experience that we had with some reportings that were coming out as the campaign was starting, I remember that there was this one journalist, I think Mike Dumke, who was also doing some FOIAs of his own. So that actually, whatever information he got from the FOIAs, we were actually also able to use to influence some of the campaign tactics and strategies that we were thinking about. So I would say journalists should continue to FOIA. I think learning from what you heard today, / like if there's any other ideas as to how we organizers can get information, that's always also helpful. And then the other thing I think is like FOIAs, we shouldn't be afraid of FOIAs going to litigation. But that's like, to me, like that's a reality, right? Sometimes I do hear like there's I personally sometimes I'm like, oh well, it's another FOIA, CPD is not gonna give us information, then we're gonna have to go into litigation. And like, even though it's a long process, but it still creates some type of pressure. And I think that it just helps, right? Like we may not be in direct contact with the journalist, but whatever information comes out of that or whatever reports come out of that, we're as organizers, sometimes we're able to take that and see how it fits in our larger strategy.
Any other suggestions as how we can increase accountability or transparency from CPD and other city bodies?
One thing I would just lift up, going back to Mick Dumke's, early reports on the gang database. They came out in ProPublica, and in addition to like filing a report about what was in the database, Dumke also put up a link to the actual data, right? So that was being shared. So the information he was able to get through FOIA was then accessible to the public. That's not what you know, newspapers often do, right? So oftentimes the Tribune will have a story about something, and the data is not shared with the public. So, you know, it's important that we also are able to get access to the data so that people can analyze it and do other things with it. So I would encourage that as well.
I guess the last thing I would add, as someone who went to journalism school, like I would just want to push back on this idea that journalism is objective, and like that stories about the gang database need to take some sort of objective, like in the middle stance, right? Like this is very clearly like something that causes harm to Black and Latinx communities. And in reality, right, nobody is safe when we live in a police state, and like that is just, that's what it is. And I don't think, our or our organizing needs that kind of support. I think from journalists and from media, to stand firmly in that, like understanding that these are wrongs and harms like caused to our community. So.
Okay, well, I think we've come to the point where we're going to be accepting questions from the audience. It looks like we don't have any questions yet. Yeah, so if people who are watching have any, would like us to clarify anything that we just talked about, or would like us to expand on anything, please share your questions. We have 10 minutes left. But is there anything that we didn't talk about or that we could expand on in the meantime, panelists?
And in terms of, access to information, I would say, it's important to remember that the gang database is just one piece of this larger system of, advanced surveillance and big data policing. So the police department is collecting tremendous amounts of data through, constantly changing and updating their forms of surveillance, right? Whether that's 35,000 video cameras spread around the city, shot spotter technologies, phone surveillance. There's just so much at work, right? License plate readers. There's just a tremendous amount of data flowing into the CPD, and increasingly, social media monitoring is the really key source of that. So I think, we need also more reporting and more FOIAs and more investigation into all the forms of surveillance and the way that they're targeting particular communities in the city.
We do have a couple of questions. Corley asked, do you have to file a FOIA in order to know whether you're in the database or not? Is that the only way to get that information?
That's the only way that we could come up with, because Chicago Police Department doesn't have a process to notify people. And there's no, like even when Wilmer we asked the city to remove his name from the gang database because of his deportation case, they come back with an official letter saying like we can't delete his information. So the FOIA ended up being the only resource that we had in our hands.
People often find out in court or in the deportation proceedings, it'll be brought up, by the other side that like you're a gang member, it's listed here. That's how people often find out. And
that also impacts what kind of bond you get, right, Andy?
It impacts the kind of bond you get, the sentencing. It also has there's research that shows that, as soon as that gang label is used in court, for prosecutors, for judges, for juries, like they hear gang member and immediately, that this switch flips, right? And it's like, oh, the way that they think about that person suddenly changes. So it has a real impact on the outcomes of people's hearings, of all kinds of hearings.
There's definitely a stigma there. So we have another question from Isaiah. Can you expand on the need for journalists to push back on objectivity?
Yeah, I think like, are you going to write in support of CPD's use of the gang database or not? Are you going to write in support of expanding surveillance and technology as sort of like reform? Or is your writing going to serve like the radical transformation that our communities like are demanding? I think is what comes to mind. And I also want to like uplift again the OIG, right? Like, I think is a really good example of that sort of like playing in the middle, like, oh, we know all these things are wrong, and if we were to do XYZ, we could fix it. That actually, you know, like we need media support that is going to like also support the demands of organizers. Yeah.
So journalists shouldn't be researching the gang database to further criminalize Black and brown people, right?
Exactly. Yes.
We have a question from Rita. If anybody can speak about FOIAs in relation to CPS schools, right? And how the databases are used to cooperate with police departments and so on. Does anybody have more information about that?
I mean, what I would say at first, and feel add to this, right? But the direct connection there is that there were, or there still are, in schools in Chicago, booking stations, right? So like that's one direct instance where we know that when there was a booking station inside a CPS school, more likely than not, people were probably being added to the gang database, right? And then the other thing that we know, based on the information that we acquired through the OIG report, is that the Chicago Police, the Chicago Public Schools, have direct access to the gang database and vice versa, right? And so the CPD also has access to the gang database, right? And so I think part of like the direct connection there is that when we have police in schools, that actually puts our young people at more risk of being criminalized, and their information ending up in a gang in a database like this, right? That then they cannot remove their information from. And so I think it's both important to continue to advocate for abolishing the gang database, but then also to add to that, like that there should not be school police officers in our CPS schools, because even if we get rid of the gang database and the SORs remain, the police officers remain, that still leaves young people and Black and brown young people at a higher risk of being criminalized or ending up hurt and physically hurt or violently harmed by CPD.
Yeah, this would be a great point of coverage for the journalists who are watching us. You know, those the schools who have SROs, you know, it would be great to look into how often the students' personal information is being added to these databases. And the last question for today is, do you know if there is any connection between the gang database and the DNA database that police departments have?
I think what's important to understand is the kind of overall structure of data, right? So the Chicago Police Department has their overall system of data management is called CLEAR. It's called the Citizen and Law Enforcement Analysis and Reporting Database. It's like a database made up of many, many databases with millions and millions of records there. And so the gang databases are part of this CLEAR system, right? They're just two of the many databases that make up the CLEAR system. The DNA databases would also be linked in through that as well, right? So what these databases do is they allow the police to link up and make connections between different pieces of data that they store in different areas. And so DNA, is increasingly a tool that police are using and collecting, upon arrest or after trials. And I think we need to be very attentive to, what's happening with that data and how does it flow to between, the local and the state and federal agencies, and how is it then being used to link up between, these different pieces of data that the police department maintains.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of this session. I'm going to open it up 1 minute for anybody who wants to finish with any thoughts, any remaining thoughts or words. Okay, well, thanks everyone for tuning in. Maybe you'll see us here next year, right? We'll see. But I do want to encourage the journalists who are watching us to to use your report, to be ethical reporters and use your reporting to empower communities rather than to criminalize them. Thanks, Ray, Alex, Andy, and everybody who's watching. for participating in FOIA Fest 2021.